I've recently done a couple of videos talking about cutting and what you need to do to cut. You need to either cut with velocity, or you need to have a degree of push or a degree of pull to the blade, and in actual fact those things often go hand in hand. But there's another element that you need to be able to cut with a sword, and it gets overlooked a lot. What that is a sharp blade. Okay? The very simple fact is that blunt swords do not cut through meat very well at all. There are some people who will they'll remain unnamed, in this video at least, who have demonstrated that you can cut through certain things with a blunt sword. Yes, you can cut a pumpkin with a blunt sword. I'll also point out you can punch through a pumpkin. You can headbutt a pumpkin into pieces. Okay, your head is equally not very sharp. You can cut through certain things. You can explode water bottles with a relatively blunt sword, although you can't really cut through it. There are various things, perhaps under certain conditions, even tatami mats or some certain types of bamboo, that you can divide with a relatively blunt blade. However, it's absolutely demonstrable that you cannot cut meat, for example the leg of a cow or the leg of a sheep, which were used historically as test cutting targets, and I'll do a different video talking about test cutting targets historically. You cannot cut through those sort of things with a blunt blade. Okay, that's not a totally true statement, because if you had a huge amount of force, like if you powered it with a great big engine that moved the blade so fast, or with so much pressure, then of course it would divide anything, just the same as a pneumatic drill can make a hole in concrete. Okay? However, a human arm cannot drive a blade through essentially meat, through body, unless the blade is sharp. And this is one of my bugbears, is that when you are reading about things, whether it's stories or whether it's actually history, or whether you're watching documentaries or films or TV shows, something that really doesn't get treated often enough is sharpness. And the fact of the matter is, anybody whose life depends on having a sharp blade, whether it's a knife or a bayonet or a sword, make sure that their weapon is sharp at all times. And we have records of, there's a famous example talking about Sudanese tribesmen, the Hadendawa tribe I think it is, of the Sudan, who were famous. They were known as fuzzy wuzzies in the 1880s, not a very politically correct term now, but they had big hair, and there's a famous description of them from, I think it's the 1870s, someone just describing their culture, and it says that every time they get off their horse or camel, whatever they're riding, and sit down to have a break, maybe have a bit of water, sit under a tree, cool down, they take their sword out of their scabbard. They had leather shields, leather bucklers, and they would strop. I don't know how they stropped. Maybe they did it forwards and backwards, or maybe they did it perpendicular, I don't know. But it said they would strop their sword edges, both edges. They had a type of double-edged broadsword essentially. They'd strop both edges of their sword on their leather buckler every time they got off their horse and sat down and had a rest. And it was just habitual. That it was something they did pretty much without thinking about it, so they knew that any given moment, if they pulled that sword out of that scabbard, it's going to have pretty much a razor sharp edge on it. And this is something that gets greatly overlooked, I think, when people are talking about weapons, particularly swords, in historical periods. The fact of the matter is, if you live day in, day out with a sword, and you live and die by a sword, as a matter of habit, as something you don't even really think about, you make sure that that sword is kept sharp. And equally, there are accounts from India of tulwars, when they weren't in use, they would wrap them in cloth that was impregnated with oil, so an oily rag essentially, but they'd wrap it up and they'd store it in the thatched roof of the house, which of course is dry, because you've got open smoke sort of fires, keeping it dry, certainly on the inside side of it, and the blade is wrapped in an oily rag so it's not going to get rusty, and of course the edge is perfectly protected. So cultures that valued sharp weapons, sharp swords in this case, really spent a lot of time making sure that they were kept sharp, but probably didn't think that much about the fact that they did that, because just the same as today, most of us brush our teeth before we go to bed. You just don't really think about doing it, it's a habit. So that would have been a habit for them, and they probably just would have done it as their daily routine. So sharpness of swords, very, very important. And just as a final demonstration before I log off here, this is not a sharp sword. Very often in movies you'll see people treat swords in a way that would mean they could not be sharp, either because of the way they handle them or because they abuse them, they stick them in the ground, and other things I've ranted about before. Blunt swords, ow, yes, that does hurt a bit, okay, but they are not going to wound you if they're completely blunt, unless they knock you out and hit you on the head or something like that. Okay, cheers.